The meeting invite arrived without urgency, a 15-minute slot added to a calendar already heavy with routine. I walked in expecting another alignment discussion, maybe a budget trim, maybe a timeline adjustment. Instead, I found unfamiliar faces seated beside people I had worked with for decades. The atmosphere was polite, careful, almost rehearsed, which told me everything before a single word was spoken. They did not accuse me of mistakes. They did not mention performance issues. My record was clean, measurable, consistent. What they spoke about instead was efficiency, cost optimization, and the need to modernize energy within the department. Those words were delivered softly, as if volume alone could make the decision feel humane. Experience, I was told, had become expensive. Not wrong. Not obsolete. Simply too costly for the direction they wanted to take. The explanation continued with slides. Charts replaced conversations. Numbers replaced memory. Years of late nights, emergency fixes, and quiet responsibility were compressed into a single row highlighted in pale gray. I watched my role summarized as an expense category rather than a function. No one looked directly at me while that line was discussed. They stared at the screen as if eye contact might introduce doubt. Then they mentioned the replacement. An intern, newly graduated, eager, bright. The introduction was almost apologetic, framed as an opportunity for growth, innovation, and speed. I was assured the transition would be smooth. I was thanked for building a foundation that someone else could now learn from quickly. The word quickly lingered in the room longer than intended. I did not interrupt. I did not defend myself. At a certain stage of life, you learn the difference between a conversation and a verdict. This was not a dialogue seeking input. It was an announcement carefully wrapped in courtesy. I listened, nodded once, and waited for the formalities to conclude. Arguing would have changed nothing except the tone. As the meeting ended, I noticed small details that stayed with me. A colleague who had once relied on me daily suddenly found a reason to check emails. Another adjusted his chair repeatedly, unable to sit still. The decision-maker avoided my side of the table altogether. Discomfort moved quietly through the room, but no one reached for it. Silence, in that moment, was the company policy. What unsettled me most was not the loss of position, but the speed of dismissal. Decades of context had been replaced by confidence in templates and optimism. They believed knowledge could be transferred like furniture. They believed systems remember themselves. That assumption revealed a generational divide far deeper than technology. It was the belief that longevity equals resistance rather than protection. It was also the moment I understood they had mistaken calm for compliance and patience for weakness. When I returned to my office, I looked around at shelves filled with notes no one else could fully interpret. Systems I had shaped patiently over years continued running without complaint. Everything appeared stable, functional, alive. That contrast was striking. The work was sound. The logic was intact. Only the perception of value had shifted. The building felt unchanged, yet something essential had quietly fractured beneath the surface. I sensed consequences forming beyond my immediate view that day. I packed slowly, not because I was unsure, but because haste felt unnecessary. Experience teaches restraint when emotion tries to rush ahead. As I shut down my computer for the last time, I believed this chapter was closing quietly. I didn't know then that by Friday, $82 million would disappear. The morning after my departure, I sat at my kitchen table and allowed myself to revisit the reality of what had happened. Not with anger, but with clarity. For years I had been the person they called when the system blinked, even slightly. Not because I was irreplaceable, but because I understood the architecture from its earliest sketch to its final form. I had lived inside its evolution. Every adjustment reflected a compromise between ambition and limitation. Every improvement carried a story. None of those stories were written in manuals. When they let me go, no one asked about the chain of decisions that shaped the work they depended on. They did not ask why certain modules blended instead of separated. They did not ask why the system healed itself in the background long before a user noticed strain. They saw the finished design and assumed it had always existed in that tidy state. They never considered the long nights invested in preventing tomorrow's crises. To them, stability looked effortless because effort had been invisible for so long. If anyone had paused long enough, they would have realized the success of the platform depended less on the lines of code and more on the quiet logic that guided it. I had built it to withstand chaos, not just function on perfect days. It recognized patterns and adapted before vulnerabilities surfaced. It predicted errors long before humans did. But none of this was magic. It was simply the result of patience, observation, and years of accumulated understanding. Knowledge that deep does not sit neatly in a binder waiting for the next person to retrieve it. During my tenure, I never guarded my work. I shared everything willingly, explained processes, guided new hires, recorded decisions meticulously. My goal was continuity, not personal power. Yet I learned over time that information, even when available, does not become wisdom unless someone has lived through the problems that shaped it. Experience is not a set of instructions. It is the residue of solved failures. And that residue cannot be transferred quickly, no matter how skilled the successor might be. I sometimes wondered if they believed I held secrets intentionally. The truth was more ordinary. I had simply become fluent in a structure that grew with me. Others saw the language, but not the dialect. They recognized the interface, but not the instincts behind its reactions. When a system becomes that layered, replacement is possible in theory, but costly in practice. Yet none of the leaders seemed curious enough to explore the depth beneath the surface. The intern who inherited my responsibilities appeared eager during my final briefing. He took notes quickly and asked thoughtful questions, but I saw it in his eyes. He understood the outline, not the foundation. He captured the shape, not the weight. He did not yet have the sense of when to intervene and when to leave an issue untouched. That kind of judgment emerges only after witnessing what happens when caution fails. In my last hour, I waited for someone to ask the essential questions. What does the system protect against that no one sees? What fragile balance must never be disturbed? Which shortcuts would create silent damage months later? But no one asked. They were content with documentation neatly arranged in folders no one had truly opened. They trusted summaries over history. As I walked out, I realized the decision had never been about understanding. It had been about comfort with change, even if the cost of that comfort remained invisible. They assumed documentation replaces memory. It doesn't. He arrived on his first morning carrying the enthusiasm of someone who still believed every problem had a clean solution. His notebook was new, his posture attentive, his confidence steady in a way that only youth can sustain. I remember watching him settle into the chair that had been mine for years. He adjusted it twice, changed the monitor height, and took a slow breath as if preparing himself for a challenge he could not yet define. There was no arrogance in him, only the bright energy of a person who had never seen a crisis unfold from the inside. In the handover meeting, he listened with an expression that mixed curiosity and determination. Every feature I explained seemed to fascinate him. He asked prompt, intelligent questions, hoping to gather the entire structure before the end of the morning. I admired the effort. His mind worked quickly, and he processed information at a pace that would have impressed me under different circumstances. Yet I could see the gap that separated comprehension from mastery. He understood the words, but not the weight behind them. He did not recognize how many of the decisions had been shaped by past emergencies. His understanding was linear, while the system he inherited was layered with history. What struck me most was his eagerness to demonstrate capability. Youth carries a silent pressure, the need to prove oneself quickly. He wanted the team to see him as more than an intern. He wanted to validate the trust they placed in him. When he told me he hoped to rewrite parts of the system to improve performance, his excitement was genuine. He viewed the structure as a project waiting to be modernized, not a complex organism balance between old constraints and new demands. He saw opportunity where experience sees caution. During my final walkthrough, I watched him navigate the menus with confidence. He located files swiftly, traced dependencies with ease, and deciphered logic with impressive speed. But he moved as someone discovering a well-organized library, not as someone aware that a single misfiled volume could disrupt everything around it. His intelligence was sharp, but it had not yet been tested by failure or by the unpredictable ways large systems respond to small changes. He approached everything with optimism, unaware that optimism is often the first casualty in high-stakes environments. After the meeting, he followed me to the elevator and thanked me for the explanations. He said he hoped to honor the work I had done. His sincerity was undeniable. I wished him well. I even believed he might grow into someone capable of carrying the system forward one day. Yet I also sensed the silent truth no one had prepared him for. He was stepping into a role built on years of accumulated insight. The responsibility he inherited required instincts he had not yet developed. The company expected immediate fluency, and he expected rapid mastery. Both expectations were illusions. As I left the building, I glanced back through the glass wall and saw him already typing, already diving into tasks he did not fully understand. His supervisor stood nearby, pleased with the transition, convinced everything would flow seamlessly. No one considered the pace at which he was working. No one recognized how heavily the system relied on subtle timing and restraint. They were eager to move forward, eager to believe that energy could replace experience without consequence. The intern, for all his talent, stepped into a storm he could not see forming. He worked quickly because quick work had always been rewarded in his world. He explored boldly because he had never witnessed the impact of a single misplaced command. He moved confidently because confidence had never collided with unseen complexity. He didn't know what he didn't know, and no one slowed him down. The building felt strangely quiet on my last morning, as if it already understood something the people inside had not yet realized. I arrived earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but because routine has a way of grounding you when everything else shifts. The security guard greeted me with his usual warmth, unaware that it would be the final time I tapped my badge against the reader. The door opened with its familiar sound, a soft confirmation of access that would disappear within hours. I paused for a brief moment, sensing the weight of that subtle transition, then stepped inside. As the pressure intensified, a second emergency meeting was called, this time with higher executives. The tone was sharper, the stakes unmistakable. Numbers were projected on the wall that showed the estimated loss climbing faster than anyone in the room had anticipated. The executives questioned every decision made that week, every adjustment, every assumption. They attempted to pinpoint a single cause, but the truth was more complex than a momentary mistake. The system was reacting exactly as it had been designed to react when uncertainty replaced understanding. During these discussions, my name returned repeatedly. Some insisted I had always been the person who could read the system's behavior before anyone else noticed shifts beneath the surface. Others remembered how quickly I responded when anomalies appeared, often resolving issues before they reached visible impact. A few admitted quietly that under pressure, they had relied on my judgment more than they realized. The idea of calling me became increasingly appealing as the loss projections grew heavier on the screen. By late afternoon, options were dwindling. The team had attempted reversals, restarts, and manual reconciliations. Nothing moved. The system had entered a protective stillness that would not break without guidance from someone who understood its deeper logic. Leadership looked at one another, silently acknowledging that the room lacked the one person who could interpret what the system was trying to communicate. The decision to reach out formed in their minds long before anyone expressed it. But no one wanted to be the first to admit that removing experience had removed stability. No one wished to reveal that the confidence displayed earlier in the week had been misplaced. And so, the room remained suspended in hesitation even as losses mounted. I was not there. I was nowhere near those screens, those hurried conversations, those rising tempers. And yet my absence shaped the entire room. The crisis revealed something far more decisive than any system failure. It revealed how deeply they had depended on knowledge they never valued. I wasn't invited. And for the first time, I didn't need to be. The first call came just after sunset, at the exact moment the sky dimmed into that quiet shade between daylight and evening. I heard the vibration before I saw the screen light up. The company name appeared clearly, a reminder of a place that had already moved on without hesitation. For a moment, I simply watched the phone glow in my hand. The ringtone continued steadily, insistent but not urgent, as if the caller believed the connection between us still held the same weight it once did. I let it continue unanswered, not out of anger, but because instinct told me that silence would reveal far more than any immediate response. A second call followed minutes later, this time from an assistant who rarely contacted me outside work hours. Her messages were usually polite, administrative, predictable. Now her number appeared with an urgency that contrasted sharply with the calm of the evening. I could picture her sitting in a crowded conference room, surrounded by anxious faces pushing her to try again. I imagined her eyes flicking between frozen dashboards and blinking notifications, searching for a solution just out of reach. The phone continued buzzing, then fell quiet. I placed it face down on the table and poured myself a glass of water. What struck me most during those moments was not the call itself, but the timing. The company had made its decision confidently, dismissing my experience with smiles and assurances. They had introduced a new face with enthusiasm, convinced that fresh energy would carry the system forward. Yet now, with the structure failing beneath them, they returned to the voice they believed unnecessary only days earlier. There was a certain irony in that. Not a bitter one, simply a revealing one. Decisions speak louder when their consequences arrive so quickly. When the phone rang a third time, the screen displayed the direct line of a senior executive who had barely acknowledged me during my final meeting. His messages had always been brief, efficient, and entirely transactional. He was not someone who typically reached out unless the situation demanded immediate intervention. Seeing his number appear told me everything I needed to know about the state of their crisis. Something had escalated beyond prediction. Something had crossed the line from inconvenience to threat. I let that call ring as well. The silence in my home felt calm in comparison to the noise I imagined inside their building. I had no obligation to return the call. My employment had ended cleanly. The badge had been turned in. The transition had been declared complete. They had made it clear that the future did not require my presence. Now they were discovering the gap between efficiency on paper and stability in practice. As the evening settled, I stepped outside for air. The night was peaceful, nothing like the frantic messages appearing on my lock screen. I could feel the distance between us widening, not physically but in principle. I had spent years providing support before anyone asked for it. I had carried responsibilities that were never documented, solved problems before they became visible, and kept the system steady through storms no one else noticed. That history was not erased by a final meeting. But it also was not something I needed to offer freely anymore. The fourth call came from a number I did not recognize, though I could guess its origin. Someone had likely been sent to try a different approach, hoping I might respond to an unfamiliar caller. The attempt was short-lived. The ringing stopped almost immediately, replaced by a quiet stillness. I stayed outside a moment longer, breathing in the evening air, feeling neither triumphant nor resentful, just resolved. Inside, the phone buzzed again, this time with a message instead of a call. A brief note asking for assistance, framed politely but lacking the respect that should have accompanied the request. I did not open it. Some boundaries do not require explanation, especially when they form naturally from the choices others have made. Leadership often assumes that access remains available simply because it was available in the past. But access is a privilege, not an entitlement. It is built on trust, responsibility, and mutual respect. When those elements disappear, the connection dissolves with them. They were not calling me out of loyalty or partnership. They were calling because the safety they relied on had vanished the moment they replaced understanding with optimism. I let the phone rest in silence, not to punish them, and not to watch them struggle. I simply recognized that stepping back mattered as much as stepping forward once did. Access isn't something you demand after you remove trust. People often assume that moments like these are driven by bitterness, as if the quiet distance I kept while the crisis unfolded was fueled by resentment. But age teaches you something that younger versions of yourself rarely understand. Life stops being a contest after a certain point. Pride no longer burns the way it once did. What matters instead is clarity, steadiness, and the ability to recognize when a situation has already declared its truth without needing your voice to reinforce it. So when I watched the calls go unanswered and the notifications fade from my phone, I did not feel triumphant. I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing that structure always reveals the truth more effectively than confrontation ever could. I have lived long enough to understand that revenge requires energy I no longer give away. Anger demands time, attention, and emotional investment. But what happened after my departure required none of those things. The system did not react out of spite. It followed the logic built into it across years of careful refinement. Its protections activated because they recognized unfamiliar patterns. Its defenses tightened because the person guiding it did not yet understand the rhythm beneath its surface. Nothing in its behavior was cruel or intentional. It responded exactly the way it was meant to respond when uncertainty replaced knowledge. When people ask why I did not rush back to explain or repair what had begun to collapse, the answer is simple. If I had intervened immediately, the lesson would have been softened. They would have believed that experience is always available on demand, even when dismissed moments earlier. They would have assumed stability is something that can be borrowed rather than earned. And they would have continued making decisions without understanding the responsibility attached to them. Sometimes stepping away is the only way to show the true value of a foundation that has been taken for granted. Speaking to those listening now, especially those who have lived through decades of work environments shifting around them, you understand the deeper meaning behind silence. It is not withdrawal. It is recognition. At a certain age, you no longer chase validation. You no longer explain what should already be known. You let actions reveal the truth, even when those actions are not your own. The collapse they faced was not engineered by me. It was engineered by their decisions. My absence simply removed the barrier that had protected them from seeing the consequences clearly. Experience is often invisible until it is removed. It is like the heartbeat of an organization, steady and unnoticed until the moment it falters. I had spent years predicting problems before they surfaced, reinforcing weak points, and guiding the system with an instinct forged through repetition and failure. When they replaced me, they did not remove a role. They removed a memory. A memory of how the system breathed, reacted, corrected, and adapted. That memory cannot be transferred through documentation or training sessions. It lives only in the people who have shaped it with time. So no, this was not revenge. Revenge is personal. What happened was structural. A natural reaction to change made without understanding its consequences. The system did not punish them. It simply lost the context it needed to function at its best. Nothing more, nothing less. And once the structure speaks, once the truth appears in numbers and stalled operations, there is no need for anger. The facts stand on their own. I watched things unfold from a distance not because I wished for failure, but because I understood that intervening too soon would hide a truth they needed to confront. Leadership had believed experience was optional. They discovered instead that experience is the quiet architecture that holds everything together. When they removed it, the architecture did what it always does under pressure. It revealed exactly where the gaps had been all along. The outcome was not shaped by emotion. It was shaped by design. I didn't break anything. I let the system speak. The crisis revealed itself in numbers, but the real cost lived in something far deeper than spreadsheets. Money can be regained with time, strategy, and effort. What cannot be rebuilt so easily is the silent strength that keeps an organization functioning even when circumstances push it toward instability. As I watched events unfold from a distance, it became clear that the true damage was not the financial loss displayed on their screens. It was the collapse of continuity, the unraveling of a thread they had never taken the time to see. Continuity is not created in meetings or written in manuals. It grows quietly through repetition, through the kind of familiarity that is earned only by living inside a system long enough to understand not just how it works, but why it behaves the way it does. When leadership decided to remove that continuity, they believed they were simply updating a role. They did not realize they were severing the history that allowed the system to breathe without disruption. The intern inherited tasks, but he did not inherit the years of judgment required to protect those tasks from unintended consequences. Without continuity, even the simplest adjustment becomes a doorway to instability. Judgment is another loss that rarely appears on official reports. You cannot quantify the instinct that tells you when to act and when to wait. It comes from mistakes made years earlier, from witnessing the exact moment a small change spiraled into a larger issue. Judgment lives in the memories of those who stayed long enough to see patterns form and dissolve. It is a skill that cannot be taught quickly because it is born from time rather than information. When they removed experience, they also removed the judgment that could have prevented a routine modification from triggering a cascade across the entire system. Institutional memory is the quiet fabric that connects past decisions to present consequences. Every organization depends on it, even when it pretends it does not. It holds the reasoning behind old choices, the lessons learned from previous failures, and the subtle practices that protect stability. When younger employees find solutions that seem obvious, it is usually because someone before them eliminated the obstacles they will never have to face. The problem is that leadership often forgets these invisible contributions. They assume that because things look simple, they must be simple. The company learned the hard way that simplicity is usually the result of complex work made invisible by those who did it well. As the crisis deepened, leadership began searching for a single moment that caused the collapse. But the truth was not located in a single mistake. It lived in a long chain of undervaluing the quiet labor that sustained them. They overlooked the continuity that kept the system predictable. They dismissed the judgment that protected them from risk. They erased the institutional memory that held everything together. When those elements disappeared, the failure they witnessed was not surprising. It was inevitable. What unfolded was not a punishment delivered by a bitter employee. It was the natural consequence of ignoring the foundations that support stability. The system did exactly what any structure does when weakened at its core. It slowed, hesitated, and finally stalled under the weight of assumptions that were never tested. The financial loss drew attention, but it was only a symptom. The deeper cost was hidden beneath layers of forgotten experience. Leadership eventually understood this, though far too late to prevent the damage. They began to see that what they had removed was not a person but a history. They had replaced a presence that carried years of adaptation with someone who had only days of orientation. They had chosen efficiency over wisdom, believing that both carried equal weight. By the time they realized the difference, the collapse was already in motion. The company would recover financially. It would rebuild the system, correct the errors, and restore the flow of operations. But something essential had shifted permanently. They learned that expertise is not a luxury. It is insurance. It guards against the unseen, anticipates the unpredictable, and reinforces the fragile points no one else remembers to examine. This was the loss they felt most deeply in the months that followed. They did not lose code. They lost foresight. The storm inside the company reached its height just as the intern felt the ground slipping beneath his feet. He had walked into the role with hope, ambition, and a genuine desire to prove himself. Now he sat in a small conference room with his hands clasped tightly together, listening to voices swirl around him as if he were both present and invisible at the same time. No one raised their voice at him. No one pointed a finger. Yet the weight of the crisis rested squarely in the silence that followed every question he struggled to answer. The senior engineers tried to reconstruct the sequence of events. They asked him to explain the changes he made, the logic behind them, the steps he followed. His responses came out fragmented, not because he was careless, but because he lacked the long view required to understand the consequences. What he saw as a harmless optimization was something he had no way of knowing carried deeper implications. He had acted with the confidence of youth, encouraged by leaders who believed the work would be simple. They placed him in a role without giving him the history that made it safe to touch. As each hour passed, the intern grew quieter. His initial shock softened into recognition, then into a kind of sober understanding. He was watching in real time what happens when talent meets responsibility too vast for its current shape. It was not his fault. It was the design of an environment that valued speed over mentorship, change over continuity, and optimism over caution. Still, he felt the impact personally. The room around him was filled with seasoned professionals trying to stabilize a system they now realized he had not been properly prepared to manage. Eventually, leadership moved him aside from the center of the crisis. Not angrily, not permanently, but gently, as if removing a burden he had never been meant to carry alone. They placed him with a supervisor who explained the deeper architecture of the platform, not in accusation, but in guidance. The intern listened carefully, absorbing every detail with the seriousness of someone who had just learned how easily large responsibilities can bend under the slightest pressure. In the days that followed, he continued working at the company, though not at the scale they had first intended. He observed more than he acted. He asked questions he had not known to ask before. He began to understand how delicate the balance of a large system truly is, how experience shapes decisions that documentation cannot fully explain. His sense of urgency softened into patience. His eagerness shifted into deliberate study. The crisis had changed him, not by destroying his confidence, but by reshaping his foundation. Some colleagues avoided speaking about the incident in his presence, thinking it might embarrass him. But others, particularly those with decades of service behind them, approached him with quiet reassurance. They recognized something familiar in his expression, the same mixture of aspiration and humility they had once felt early in their own careers. They reminded him that mistakes, especially public ones, are not the end of a professional life. They are the beginning of wisdom, provided a person stays open to learning from the impact. He did not lose his job. He did not become the symbol of the company's failure. Leadership eventually acknowledged that the responsibility placed on him had exceeded both his experience and training. They publicly stated that the collapse resulted not from the intern's actions alone, but from decisions made at levels far above him. Slowly, the tension around his presence eased, replaced by a respect earned not through perfection, but through resilience. Months later, he would look back on that Friday as the day he truly grew into his profession. Not because he succeeded, but because he discovered the depth of what success requires. He learned to respect complexity, to ask questions before acting, and to recognize that brilliance without history can become fragile under pressure. He gained something far more valuable than a flawless start. He gained perspective. He was never the villain of the story. He was the evidence. In the days after the crisis, when the company was still struggling to make sense of what had happened, my life had already shifted into a calmer rhythm. I woke each morning without urgency, without alarms buzzing against my sense of worth, without the weight of decisions waiting on my desk before sunrise. There was an unexpected peace in that transition, not because I had left something behind, but because I had stepped into a space that allowed me to breathe in a way I had not realized I had been holding back for years. I did not scramble for opportunities or send out hurried messages in search of validation. I had lived long enough to know that rushing invites the wrong doors, while steadiness invites the right ones. I spent the first week organizing my thoughts, reflecting on the work I had done and the decades that had shaped me. With each passing day, the sense of loss faded and a sense of clarity settled in its place. Experience teaches you that your value does not diminish just because a company fails to recognize it. You carry your expertise with you, and in the right environment, that expertise speaks louder than any title. I learned long ago that desperation is loud, but competence is quiet, and quiet competence eventually draws the kind of attention that matters. On the 8th day, I received a message from a former colleague who had joined another firm months before. He had heard whispers through the professional network, not about the crisis itself, but about my departure. He asked if we could speak. Our conversation lasted less than half an hour. He did not ask for explanations. He did not probe for details. He simply said that their organization valued maturity, precision, and the kind of judgment that cannot be taught quickly. He believed I would be an asset if I was open to a new chapter. There was no urgency in his voice. No pressure. Just recognition. 2 days later, I met with his team. The atmosphere felt entirely different from the one I had left behind. These people listened with intention. They understood complexity, not as an obstacle, but as a sign of depth. They asked about my approach, about my philosophy, about how I handled uncertainty. Not once did they ask why the last company let me go. They were more interested in how the work had shaped me than in the politics that had removed me. By the end of the meeting, they offered me a role that felt not like a replacement of the past, but an elevation built on the work I had already done. Moving forward did not require fanfare. I entered the new space quietly. My first weeks there were marked by trust rather than suspicion. They gave me room to assess the system, understand its architecture, and identify the small adjustments that strengthen a structure from within. Here, patience was valued. Here, questions were welcomed. Here, wisdom was not dismissed as outdated but appreciated as the anchor that kept innovation from drifting into chaos. I did not have to prove myself loudly. My work did that on its own. As the crisis at my former workplace continued to circulate through industry conversations, the truth eventually became clear to those who paid attention. The failure was not an indictment of my departure, but of their lack of understanding. And curiously, that realization only strengthened my standing in the places where experience mattered most. Doors opened without me knocking. People reached out without me seeking them. My reputation, once treated lightly, now carried weight that came not from conflict, but from consistency. In time, I built something even stronger than the role I had left. I built a space where my judgment mattered, where my history had purpose, and where my voice was not heard only in crisis, but in planning, guidance, and mentorship. I did not rise because of what happened. I rose because I had already done the work that made rising possible. The crisis simply unveiled what had been true all along. Life offers second chapters to those who walk away with grace rather than noise. I did not chase validation from the place that let me go. I walked toward the place that recognized what I carried. Some doors close loudly, others close softly, but the ones that open afterward reveal who understood your worth from the beginning. Some doors only open once silence proves its weight. There comes a moment in every long career when you realize you are no longer speaking only to colleagues or clients. You are speaking to a generation that has walked through storms, rebuilt themselves after losses, and carried responsibilities that shaped entire families. This final message is for those who know what it means to work quietly, to build steadily, and to endure changes that arrive without fairness or warning. It is meant for the people who have been told they take too long, cost too much, know too much, speak too carefully, or stand too firmly. You may have been labeled senior, but experience is not a weakness. It is a currency that many underestimate until they are forced to understand its worth. If you have ever sat through a meeting where younger voices talked over years of hard-earned clarity, then you know the quiet sting that comes when your insight is dismissed before it is even heard. If you have been passed over for the sake of bright enthusiasm presented as innovation, then you understand what it feels like to watch decisions drift toward risk you have already lived through. And if you have ever been thanked generously while being pushed aside, then you know the strange mixture of dignity and disappointment that comes with being replaced not because you failed, but because someone believed your season had ended. Listen carefully now. Your value is not determined by how loudly the world embraces you. Your value is shaped by everything you have already done when no one else wanted to stay late, when no one else knew how to fix what was falling apart, when no one else understood the quiet balance that keeps a structure standing. You carry a depth that cannot be taught in a seminar or absorbed in a crash course. You understand consequences before others recognize patterns. You see risk before others notice movement. This is not age. This is mastery. Most offices were still dark. Only a few screens glowed in distant corners, belonging to those who lived by deadlines rather than schedules. I organized my desk with deliberate care. Papers were sorted, files arranged, drawers emptied with a quiet precision that came naturally after so many years. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. Just a slow unwinding of presence. When you have spent decades building something, departure feels less like a door closing and more like a final line being drawn under a chapter you thought would continue longer than it did. The handover meeting began mid-morning. A small conference room had been prepared, the kind used for onboarding new employees or discussing quarterly updates. The intern sat at one end of the table, posture straight, ready to absorb whatever remained to be passed along. Leadership joined with practiced politeness, their expressions neutral but overly attentive. They thanked me for my service. They highlighted the importance of smooth transitions. They emphasized the company's gratitude for my professionalism. Their tone held the unmistakable quality of a script recited many times before. Throughout the meeting, I explained processes slowly and clearly. Not because I needed to justify my work, but because clarity felt like the final gift I could offer. I pointed out where attention was required, where the system behaved unpredictably under stress, where patience mattered more than speed. The intern nodded eagerly, taking notes he believed captured the full depth of the conversation. Everyone else listened with the detached ease of people who assumed they would never need this knowledge themselves. Polite smiles filled the room at the end of the briefing. A handshake here. A word of appreciation there. It was all gracious, all tidy, all organized. I knew the gestures were sincere in form, if not in understanding. To them, the structure I built looked stable enough to withstand any transition. To me, it felt like leaving a complex instrument in the hands of someone who had never heard its full range. But I kept that thought to myself. Professionalism often means respecting the confidence of others even when you recognize its fragility. After the meeting, I returned to my office one last time. I removed my personal items with unhurried movements. A framed photo. A small plant that had survived years of fluorescent lighting. A notebook filled with sketches from early design stages. Objects that carried stories too quiet to recount in farewell speeches. The room felt unfamiliar once they were gone, as if my absence had already begun rewriting the space. When everything was packed, I walked to the front desk and handed my security badge to the administrator. She accepted it with a smile touched by routine rather than sentiment. I felt no resentment as the card left my hand. Loss is easier to manage when dignity remains intact. I stepped outside into the afternoon light, the building standing tall behind me, unaware of the tension forming deep within it. I did not glance back for long. I did not second-guess the calm that guided me. And I did not carry bitterness. As I walked away, I understood something very clearly. I didn't warn them. Not out of spite, out of professionalism. In large systems, the most important elements are often the ones no one notices. Over the years, I had built a quiet network of protections woven beneath the visible surface of the platform. Not dramatic features, not secret passages, simply the kind of underlying logic that keeps a structure standing long after its designers stop watching it. These were safeguards created for moments of distraction, for days when stress overrides judgment, for nights when someone moves too fast because deadlines push harder than caution. They were not traps. They were the invisible rails that kept everything aligned when human error tried to tilt the balance. The company never asked about these layers because they worked flawlessly. In their eyes, stability meant simplicity. They assumed that if nothing broke, nothing complicated existed beneath the calm. What they did not understand was that prevention is never loud. Prevention is a field of invisible walls, reacting instantly to interruptions before those interruptions turn into disasters. I had spent years studying where the system tended to falter during intense workloads, during transitions between modules, during periods of unusual traffic, and I reinforced those areas with quiet resilience. Nothing in those protections required special access or secret knowledge. They simply required awareness of how fragile a seemingly strong structure becomes when rushed hands attempt improvement without observation. One of those protections involved a fail state designed to preserve data integrity. It acted only when certain combinations of commands occurred too quickly or without the expected verification sequence. The idea was simple. When unusual activity appeared, the system would pause, protect its core processes, and wait for human confirmation before proceeding. That safeguard had saved countless hours of recovery work in the past. But it was subtle. It needed someone who understood its purpose to guide it gently out of the pause and back into operation. Another safeguard involved redundancy logic. The system constantly checked its own outputs against parallel calculations running quietly in the background. When the two disagreed beyond a certain threshold, operations slowed automatically to prevent a chain reaction of faulty data. This was a protective measure, not an obstruction. But to understand it, someone needed to know why a slowdown could be a sign of health rather than malfunction. The intern had not yet learned that distinction, and no one thought to explain it to him. There was also a mechanism built to respond to what I called silent negligence. Not malicious actions, not reckless behavior, simply the innocent mistakes that occur when someone is eager to make improvements. The system responded to irregular sequences by isolating affected modules and preserving the original state until the issue could be safely reversed. It was a design based on years of watching how optimism can lead to unintended consequences. I created it not because I doubted the competence of others, but because I understood the pressure to innovate quickly. None of these mechanisms were dangerous. None were hidden with ill intent. They were the reason the platform ran smoothly year after year. But they required interpretation. They required a history that no training session could replicate. They needed someone who sensed the rhythm of the system, who knew when a pause meant protection and when it meant obstruction. Without that sense, the protections could appear confusing or unnecessary, prompting someone inexperienced to override them in hopes of speeding up the process. On my last day, I had considered highlighting these details, but the meeting was focused on transition, not comprehension. They believed the system was self-explanatory. They believed documentation replaced experience. They believed confidence could substitute for history. So the safeguards remained unmentioned, not because I wished for trouble, but because no one asked about the foundation. They only asked about the visible walls. When everything later began to unravel, the team searched the code for hidden triggers. They assumed complexity lived in the machinery. But the truth was quieter and far more ordinary. The collapse did not come from an error buried in the system. It emerged from something far simpler, something they never questioned. It wasn't in the system. It was in the assumptions. Friday began like any other end-of-week cycle, with the usual flurry of quiet adjustments and final checks before the system carried the company through the weekend. The intern arrived early, eager to show progress and reassure leadership that the transition had been seamless. His confidence carried a youthful brightness, the kind that assumes stability simply because nothing has gone wrong yet. He logged in, reviewed a list of pending optimizations, and selected a routine adjustment meant to streamline a data flow that had always appeared slightly slower than the others. It was the kind of modification I had made countless times, but always with caution and context. To him, it was an uncomplicated improvement waiting to be executed. He moved through the menus with practice speed. The change was small, almost trivial, a detail that seemed harmless in isolation. No alerts appeared. No error messages flashed. Everything behaved exactly as the documentation suggested it should. He clicked confirm, convinced he had just strengthened the platform. In the silence that followed, the system accepted the adjustment without resistance. It did not crash. It did not blink. It simply absorbed the instruction and continued functioning as if nothing had happened. From his perspective, it was a success. For the first hour, the dashboard remained calm. The usual activity metrics flowed through their routines. Reports refreshed as expected. Leadership settled into the comfort of believing the transition had been flawlessly executed. The intern allowed himself a quiet moment of pride, unaware that the real test of a system is not its immediate reaction, but its behavior under pressure. And every Friday, pressure arrived slowly, disguised within the normal rise of transactional demands. Shortly before noon, the earliest signs appeared, subtle enough that no one noticed. A few numbers displayed longer load times. A scheduling service hesitated before executing its next cycle. A reconciliation module paused briefly before sending confirmation signals. These moments were small enough to be dismissed as typical end-of-week congestion. No one thought to investigate further. The intern refreshed the screen, saw the values reappear, and assumed everything was fine. As demands increased, the safeguards I had designed quietly activated. The system sensed inconsistency in the data flow. It attempted to protect its core by slowing certain operations. But the intern, seeing a slowdown without knowing the meaning behind it, believed performance was degrading rather than self-correcting. He initiated a secondary adjustment to accelerate the process. Again, nothing alarming happened immediately. The interface allowed the change. The logs recorded it. The system responded with the same outward calm, still trying to interpret what it perceived as irregular behavior. By early afternoon, misalignment began to spread. Numbers that usually matched across departments drifted apart. Inventory figures lost synchronization. The financial engine, unable to reconcile the inconsistencies, entered its protective pause. Transactions that typically processed every few minutes now sat waiting for confirmation that never arrived. Staff began refreshing screens repeatedly, puzzled by the delays. The intern checked the monitors and saw a growing list of stalled operations. Then the first revenue report froze. A second followed. A third attempted to process, failed twice, and joined the others in silence. The slowdown rippled outward, touching every system dependent on real-time accuracy. Calls started coming from multiple departments asking why confirmations were not appearing. Leaders walked quickly through hallways, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. The intern, overwhelmed by the sudden wall of notifications, tried to reverse his earlier changes. But the system, reacting exactly as it was designed to react under uncertainty, refused to move forward without a stable baseline. What appeared as stubbornness was simply protection. What appeared as malfunction was a shield locking itself into place. Within the hour, the entire revenue cycle halted. The numbers stopped updating entirely. The logs filled with unresolved calculations, each one waiting for clarity the system could not find. No one in leadership understood the scale of what was unfolding. They saw screens frozen, not the consequences forming beneath them. And that was the moment the financial team ran the first emergency estimate. That's when the 82 million started evaporating. The first emergency meeting happened before mid-afternoon, called so abruptly that half the team arrived without laptops. The conference room that usually held quiet project updates now carried the charged atmosphere of a crisis unfolding faster than anyone could contain it. Screens displayed frozen dashboards, incomplete reports, and long chains of pending transactions waiting for confirmation. At first, people spoke in measured tones, convinced that the delay was a temporary glitch. But as the minutes accumulated and the numbers refused to respond, restraint gave way to tension. Managers leaned over one another trying to piece together what had changed since the morning. Some blamed a server update. Others suspected a vendor issue. A few whispered that the new adjustments made by the intern might have affected a sensitive module, though none said it loudly enough for him to hear. The intern sat near the corner of the table, eyes fixed on the data attempting to revive itself. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a growing recognition that something had slipped out of control without warning. As the next hour unfolded, voices rose. Questions overlapped. Explanations contradicted one another. People scrolled frantically through logs hoping for a simple error to blame. The volume in the room increased with each stalled transaction. Screens refreshed again and again, always returning the same silent results. The leadership team attempted to maintain order, but even their composure faltered as the scale of the freeze became undeniable. Revenue was no longer delayed, it had stopped entirely. It was not long before my name entered the conversation. At first, it was mentioned gently, almost in passing, as someone wondered if any undocumented processes might have been affected. Then another voice added that perhaps only I knew the exact behavior of the safeguards. Someone else pointed out that I had always monitored these systems personally during high-volume cycles. The room settled briefly as the pattern became clearer. The people who had once insisted the transition would be seamless were now confronted with the reality that they had underestimated the foundation supporting their operations. The question no one wanted to ask finally escaped into the open. Could I be reached? The suggestion floated hesitantly at first, as if even speaking it admitted a failure larger than the technical issue itself. A discussion followed about whether contacting me would be appropriate, whether I would even respond, whether asking for help so soon after my departure would reflect poorly on leadership. The intern looked down at his hands, not out of shame, but out of recognition that he had stepped into a responsibility he had not yet grown sturdy enough to carry. Professionals over 50 live with a kind of clarity that younger teams often mistake for caution. They do not realize that your patience comes from recognizing what happens when hurried choices collide with reality. They do not see that your silence is not hesitation but evaluation. They interpret your steady pace as reluctance, unaware that certainty takes time and shortcuts often lead straight into hidden cost. When they overlook you, it is because they have not yet lived long enough to understand the price of overlooking the people who hold the memory of the work. The truth is simple. There will always be places that chase youth because it is easy to see. There will always be companies that choose energy over understanding because the consequences have not yet touched them. And there will always be leaders who believe that the fastest path is the most impressive one. But you, the professional who has walked through decades of change, must remember that none of this defines your worth. Your career does not end when someone younger takes your seat. Your relevance does not fade because a new idea arrives wrapped in confidence. Experience does not diminish. It compounds. So let this message settle deeply. Do not fear being replaced. Fear staying in places where the people around you confuse youth with wisdom. Do not shrink because someone suggests you have reached the limit of your usefulness. Age has never been the end of capability. It is the beginning of clarity. Time does not make you obsolete. It makes you dangerous if you design quietly.